right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, I'm Michelle Milam, Crime Prevention Manager for the Richmond Police Department, and I'm just happy to be here with all of you live to talk about a really serious and important thing for us to all talk about, which is hate and how we address hate in our communities, and really working together to help identify hate and hate crimes, how you can work together with law enforcement, how we work with the district attorney's office, how state and federal law may apply to addressing issues of hate, and how we can really come together as a community to address the issue. So we have a really good discussion that will be here today. Basically, just to kind of go over a little bit of the format for today, what we will be doing is we will be hearing from our chief, we'll be hearing from some of the members of our command staff that have to deal with investigations of hate crimes. And we're also going to be hearing from members of the community, talking about the seriousness of hate and why it's important for us to be able to come together to be able to, number one, identify hate crimes when they occur, and be able to work together on helping to solve them. So with that said, I think that probably the first thing I would like to do is I would like to introduce our Chief French, to talk a little bit about why she wanted to have this forum, and a little bit of background information for us for today.
Thank you, Michelle. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I thought it was important to engage our community regarding hate crimes because of the recent hate crimes we've experienced around the country. The tragic events that have occurred locally in San Francisco, Oakland, and the greater Bay Area, as well as the events that we've seen nationally in Atlanta, Charlottesville, and countless other areas around the globe, serve as chilling reminders that too many communities are being targeted by hate, and that these hate-motivated crimes are not confined by any geographic barrier. I want to start by saying hate has no place in our country, and especially in our community. When a crime is motivated by hate, it is not just an attack on an individual, it is an attack on our entire community. We take these crimes seriously, and we work with many community partners, some of which you will hear from tonight, to address hate crimes in our community. The purpose of tonight's forum is to provide you with information on what constitutes a hate crime, how we address these incidents here at RPD, and making sure our community knows how to report these incidents so that they are addressed appropriately. So what is a hate crime? A hate crime is a criminal act committed in whole or in part because of the victim's actual or perceived disability, gender, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or association with a person or group with one or more of these actual or perceived characteristics. As you can see, that covers a lot of protected groups, and all of these groups are represented here in Richmond. We know there's a need to protect the vulnerable members of our community from hate crimes. We also know that hate crimes and hate incidents are heinous acts that demand immediate attention, response, and resolution. If a hate crime is not recognized for its hatred, the responsible parties and hate groups become emboldened and often feel like their sentiments are shared or accepted. We as a community cannot and will not tolerate hate. I hope that you'll be part of the solution by reporting hate crimes if you are a victim or a witness, being an advocate for those that are vulnerable in our community, and speaking out against hate and intolerance. Next, we're going to hear some voices from our community. Michelle?
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. So the first thing that we wanted to do is when we started having this conversation is we really wanted to bring together some voices from the community to talk about how we work on these issues of hate together. And so we really wanted to allow some space and some time for that. And so the first voice that you'll hear is Harpreet Sandhu, and Harpreet will introduce himself, and he'll also talk to you a little bit more about hate crimes, their impact, and why it's important for us to come together around these issues.
Thank you, Chief French, for having this community event on Zoom, and Michelle Malam, who's always been a very integral person that with our community, always making sure that the concerns of the Sikhs and residents of Richmond and our surrounding areas were always addressed. Hate crime is a very unfortunate event that happens against many different communities. And of course, this hate crime in terms of statistics only started in 2000, late 2000, to be taken in by FBI and the Justice Department. Unfortunately, Sikhs in this community have been victims of hate crimes for many years, going back to July 13. And in July 13 and July 2nd, individual was shot, and next person was shot again on July 5th. And sadly, in August of 5th, 2012, at Oak Creek, a temple in Oak Creek, 6 Sikhs were killed in Wisconsin. Again, in Richmond in 2017, 2 individuals, 2 brothers, were also killed in Richmond. Again, and then again, Baljeet Singh in 2016. What's really sad is just a few days ago, nationally, another event happened in Indianapolis at a FedEx building. 8 people were shot, and 4 of those were Sikhs. But the sad part is that hate crime has exacerbated in just this couple of months in this country, and that's unfortunate. But the communities that are affected leave devastating effects on families and friends and neighbors. And how do we combat that is very important for our city and our individuals of the cities. But the sad part is that if you look at FBI, how they gather statistics, they gather on the fact of perception. For instance, if I were to be walking somewhere street tomorrow and I was abused or killed or what have you, and some guy tells, well, that serves you right, you Arab. And when the statistics were taken earlier, they would be considered as if it's attack on a person who the person thought was a Muslim, thinking that I was a Muslim person, but not as a Sikh. So that's the biggest difficulty, is perception. FBI still counts people on perception, not actual victims, based on how you identify hate crime. So this is a struggle no matter where you are, no matter which community you come from. The identification, it pretty much falls on the community to push either the district attorney or the police department to say, hey, look, this is a hate crime that has just committed against some individual and a community. And that is a high bar sometimes to achieve, even though there is a large, as Chief has mentioned, a large amount of people that can be identified under the hate crime and statute. So I'll talk perhaps more, but I want to be cognizant of the time that we're given here today. So, but we need to come together as a city. I remember being on the Human Relations Commission for City of Richmond and working, and that was one of the things we were working with. And I hope the Human Relations Commission is all out throughout the city's work on bringing people together and understanding that we have a very common bond in this city or any other city. And I think Richmond does its best, and the department is always welcoming information and making sure that the voice of the people are heard. And I'm very happy that Chief French continues that legacy for Richmond for many, many years, although we have had tough history going back in Richmond. If you go back, and I'm sure our friends from NAACP will talk about way back in the 70s, what the department used to be, when actually the Justice Department initiated CSR, where Justice Department came into community to handle both. Back then it was not hate crime, it was just community awareness and bring community together. So, but in any case, thank you, Chief. Thank you, Ms. Mallam, always being somebody who always brought the community together.
Thank you so much. You know, that really, you really brought me back to many things that the community has experienced over the years. And I really thank you for being a leader and sharing that with us. We want to go on and we want to include some more voices here. Mr. Willie Robinson is representative of the Richmond NAACP. And so we'd like to invite you, Mr. Robinson, to have a few words to also share how you feel that hate crimes have impacted the African-American community and why you think it's important to come together.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Michelle, and to the Chief. A little historical perspective suggests, and if you know the history, hate crime is in the fabric of our American society. The NAACP as we now know it, is celebrating its 112th year. And it was born out of a hate crime situation relative to hanging of Blacks. And so from a historical perspective, it goes back to slavery coming to this country and us being brought here and not being accepted as human beings for the most part, but the Constitution reflected we are 4/5 of a human being. But bringing things up to date, Richmond NAACP has been around since 1944, and some of the things that has happened relative to hate crime, even just integrating neighborhoods, jobs, and all those things come into existence from the standpoint of our heritage or history in the United States. And it's expanding it's not expanding, but it's more attention is being brought to it because statistically, they've not been tracking it as Harpreet had mentioned, the government has not been tracking it in a sense of a crime relative to a particular race or ethnicity or special group. And now we have these protections. So we're getting more visibility of it, and particularly now in the light of this pandemic issues associated with the AAPI community and what we're doing. The NAACP as a branch and a part of its function is to provide advocacy for eliminating these kinds of things. So we have a complaint process in place that if anyone, no matter your color, feel that that you want to be a part of having the NAACP advocate for you, we have a complaint process you submitted, and what we would do become a part of your advocacy for bringing to the attention and trying to get results. And history of the NAACP suggests that we've gotten results over the long period of time. There's been no specific addressing of this by the NAACP in the Richmond branch, but we were given advisory back in the early part of the year from the national office, recognizing that the NAACP is a part of a major coalition throughout the country to combat this, eliminate it, where, as our mission and vision says, that we will seek out and eliminate all crimes against humanity and all people of color.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robinson. I think that that's just a very important and poignant thing you said about it being a part of the fabric of, unfortunately, some of the things that have gone on in this nation, which is another reason for us to come together and address it, because oftentimes when we try to address this, it's one community pitted against another. And I think it's important for all communities to come together and recognize a common and shared struggle. With that, I want to introduce Jamin with Richmond Rainbow Pride to come in and share some experiences and reflections on why it's important to come together against hate in the community.
Hi, hello, my name is Jamin Purcell. I'm with Richmond Rainbow Pride. So we are only in existence for the last 7 years. We were actually brought together because there was an attack on, there was essentially hate speech was being thrown at one of our city council members, Javanka Beckles, in the city council chambers. We realized that there was one of the biggest problems that we face as an LGBT community is that apathy can be interpreted as acceptance. And so whether that's by the perpetrators or by the public, or even worse, the victims, if left unchallenged, the hate persists and will grow and will escalate, and like it was doing. And so we made a conscientious choice that we were going to band together to be able to try and not just show that we were present and that we were going to not hide within the community, but that also we are a part of this community and we're a part of the people who help build it. And I think one of the things that we try to really focus on is understanding that hate crimes are always intersectional. It's always like when there is a member of the LGBT community who is targeted, there is always some facet that is also interrelated to some other thing, whether that be gender nonconforming, whether that be because they're Black, and or other member of the people of color. We have a huge issue that we face, and just like Mr. Robinson said, there's an underreporting of these hate crimes, and that there's not a good tracking nationwide, or even within the state of California, which tries to do its best. And so it's something that we constantly have to face. And the LGBT community pretty much is roughly about 1/5 of the hate crimes that take place within the United States. So what we try to do is we try to show that we, as our organization of Richmond Rainbow Pride, we try to bring together a community to show that we are intersectional, that we are a part of the greater fabric of all of these different communities, and we touch upon them. And we try to make sure that we don't listen to the patriotic and what the hate groups want us to do, which is to divide ourselves. We actually want to reach out to the other communities and let them know that not only we are part of them, but we want to help them grow, but we also want to incorporate them so that we can grow and make sure that we can spread our message that we want to, that we need to end this. And I think as well, we've seen a big rise in hate crime within the last 2 years. I mean, I think we all understand a large portion of the reasoning, but the pandemic in particular has harkened back to a lot of the HIV and AIDS scapegoating that happened, whether that was back in those days, it was people in color and people from African descent. Now it's people of Asian descent, but the LGBT community is always held at the center of that, and it is it's unconscionable. And so we just need to make sure that we are keeping the government and law enforcement aware that we're watching them, and we're hoping that they're going to help track those crimes and help us better understand what we face so we can present it to those people who aren't affected by it.
Thank you so much, Shaman. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the point you brought up about intersectionality. I think that's a really important piece in terms of doing this kind of work, is realizing, how many cross sections there are that are impacted by this. As we go forward, I wanted to take it into some of our panelists, from the law enforcement side, and hopefully we'll be able to have a dialogue, a conversation, get some of your questions in before this is over. But I wanted to first introduce Paul Graves from our Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office to talk a little bit about their role, and then also kind of the local, the state and the national role in terms of hate crime. I know many people have questions about, enhancements. What does it mean? Federal versus state versus county. How does the county handle these once the police department handles them? So I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
All right, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to try to stay within my time here. But I would start by saying that our office takes hate crimes very seriously, and we are united with the community in a zero tolerance for hate of any kind in our community. I became a community prosecutor out in Richmond in October of 2018, and I did write a training memorandum to the officers and detectives, everybody in the department, sort of on what is needed to get a prosecution for a hate crime. Because oftentimes we know a crime is a hate crime in our gut. We know it. But as a prosecutor, we are only allowed to file charges if we ethically believe we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So by helping with the investigative side, by letting them know what we need to file charges, we are in a better position moving forward to actually get these charges filed. Once a case is sent to our office, it is reviewed by a committee to determine whether or not a hate crime has been committed or whether a hate crime enhancement is appropriate. Now, I'm going to start by I'm going to try to be quick and not get too legal, but I do have to say that hate crime statutes do have to be in alignment with the First Amendment of our Constitution of the United States, freedom of speech. So California has tried to strike a balance between First Amendment rights and violations of the law. So hate crime statutes don't regulate speech. I know we find much of the speech we hear every day completely offensive, but for an actual crime to be committed, it's important to understand that we're talking about acts of violence, threats of violence, or damage to property towards a selected victim because of their status, and an intention to interfere with that victim's protected rights. Unfortunately, in my 25 plus years in the district attorney's office, I've learned that we just can't use the criminal justice system to get people to act like just normal human beings and be accepting of everybody. And it's unfortunate, but the hate crime statute is geared specifically towards these three areas. Use of force is fairly self-explanatory. Threatened use of physical violence has to be something that a reasonable person would be afraid because the suspect appeared to be able to carry out the threat. Or the third way to violate it is to damage to property. Where it becomes difficult is the crime or the force or the threat has to be done in whole or in part because of the other person's actual perceived race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, nationality, all the protected classes that Chief French talked about. So essentially, they specifically target the individual based on their status. So to break it down to, let's just take a simple bank robbery. White male goes in to do a bank robbery, and he's going to do a bank robbery. And he stands in line with everybody else. And it just so happens that the teller that becomes available for him happens to be somebody in a protected class. Now, during the course of the robbery, he makes some completely offensive, inappropriate statements to that victim. It's not a hate crime unless we can prove that that teller or that bank was specifically targeted because of that person's status as a protected class. So that's what makes it a little bit difficult in these prosecutions. Also, with the regulation of speech, another example for you just to help kind of draw the line for people who are curious about how this works. Let's say you have a victim in a protected class who's walking on the other side of the street, and our suspect is on the opposite side of the street and yells out to the victim, "Why don't you just go home to your own country? You and your people are," and insert whatever you want. Okay? Completely offensive behavior. None of us on this call tolerate that. The problem is there's no force, there's no threat of physical force, and there's no damage to property. So while we all can agree that it is patently offensive speech, it's not a violation of the hate crime statute, even if the victim perceived it as a threat. If, however, in that same scenario, the suspect crossed over the street and got in front of the victim aggressively and impeded their walking and basically said, "You better turn around and leave because nobody wants you here. And if you don't, I'm going to hurt you." Now it is elevated to the level of a hate crime. So this is often where the investigations break down, and we need to talk about how to prove that the conduct was motivated by somebody's race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation. One last example before I tell you what Richmond Police Department does. Let's say that you have a neighbor that plays loud music and has parties, and you have a couple kids, or the suspect has a couple kids. And one night at about 1 o'clock in the morning, he goes over to his neighbors, bangs on the door, threatens to beat him up if he doesn't turn the music down, and says some completely inappropriate, offensive comments. The police arrive, and we would want to go immediately to this as a hate crime, but is the factor the race of the person, or is it because of the loud music and parties keeping people awake? So in these situations, what we have to do is law enforcement has to look at prior police reports involving this victim or this suspect. Are they always targeting the same race, ethnicity, protected class? Maybe there's a neighbor on the other side that engages in the exact same behavior, and the suspect is totally fine with that. You would also want to talk to relatives, neighbors, friends of the suspect, and find out if they've said anything inappropriate before, if they've displayed an animosity towards this particular group. Do they have tattoos? Are they, doing things that would prominently identify them as white supremacist or any other group that generally goes around and hates specific groups? So these are the things that are faced with, and I know Richmond Police Department does a great job in classifying crimes where your gut tells you it could be a hate crime, so that we can conduct this full-on investigation to determine if we can make it. And that's where we really want our law enforcement agencies to be. I can honestly tell you, it's very difficult to get to the level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but you should be proud of a police department that takes the extra step to make sure and check all the boxes and see if it is there and if we can prove it. Since 2018, I ran statistics, or had somebody run statistics for my office. I'm not sure how completely accurate they are, but of just hate crime sections, 6 cases were submitted, 3 were filed. Of those 3, 2 ended in dismissal of the charges after the suspect completed an informal diversion program. And that would be a decision based on their prior lack of record, and consultation with the victim, and obviously the trend towards, not incarcerating people. But it appeared to me that the individuals had to go through cultural training and anger management training before the charges were dismissed. 1 is still pending, and the remaining 3 were not filed based on insufficient evidence. So working together, though, these statistics aren't to discourage you from reporting. They're actually to encourage you from reporting, because Richmond has been trained and taught to look at these prior reports. And oftentimes, even if a case isn't filed, maybe the same individual engages in completely offensive conduct again. We can look at that prior report, we can put these reports together, and we can get a case filed. And it's only working together and people having a voice and calling out people who engage in this behavior that we will actually be able to hopefully make a difference and make sure that people who are engaging in this conduct are held accountable. So Michelle, thank you very much for your time. I did want to talk about federal statutes. I know you mentioned federal statutes. I am familiar with the Shepherd-Bird Hate Crime Prevention Statute of 2009. What that statute provided was financial assistance to state, local, and tribal jurisdictions to investigate hate crimes. The violation of the federal statute is actually even more difficult than our local statutes. Under that statute, for the federal government to prosecute somebody for a hate crime, it's essentially the same elements we have, but also requires violent acts resulting in bodily injury or attempts to inflict injury through the use of fire, firearms, explosives, and incendiary devices and other dangerous weapons. Now, in my 3 years out of Richmond, I don't think I've seen necessarily one of these. But it is there. It is a tool for us in the event we ever have something like this happen. But really our best tool right now is our state statutes and aggressive law enforcement bringing these to our attention, and the district attorney's office that takes them seriously, and putting as many cases together as we can to get a full picture of the perpetrator so that we actually can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it is a hate crime. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Paul. And with that, I'm going to move on to Captain Simmons. And Captain Simmons is going to talk a bit about the investigative role. So Captain Simmons, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, good evening, everybody.
I'm sorry, Captain Simmons, for those of you who have questions, we will have time for question and answer. So we have one more speaker, and then after that, we'll have Q&A.
Good evening, everybody. Captain Simmons. I command our investigations bureau. So I wanted to bring to light the fact that the Richmond Police Department actually has a policy section that's solely dedicated to addressing the issues of hate crimes and providing very detailed and very specific guidelines to officers and detectives and all personnel of the Richmond Police Department on how they are to handle hate crimes from the preliminary investigative standpoint all the way to the detailed investigative part of it, to training that's required, which you'll hear about in a little bit here. So this is definitely an area of law and enforcement and care and concern that we have deeply, to the point where there's a policy that regulates it very specifically. And even within the context of this policy, it talks about preventative measures. So we don't want officers just responding to a hate crime after the fact or investigating a hate crime after the fact. Really, at the heart of what the chief wants out of this policy is that officers are engaged with the community to a point to where we're actually able to deter or prevent hate crimes from happening in the first place. Obviously, we can't be everywhere all at once, and it's not intended that a police officer is going to be the end all be all. Really, it's the combined effort of all of us as a community that's really going to see, hopefully, hate crimes be eliminated from our community. So one of the factors that's listed in our policy as it relates to prevention is actually what we're doing right now. If you look at just at your screen, there is a kaleidoscope of races and nationalities just even represented in this conversation right now that really is personified throughout our whole community. We are talking about this issue because we do not want this to be an issue that negatively impacts our community. By discussing it, by talking about it, by keeping it at the forefront of everybody's mind, then we're more conscientious of it, we're more aware of it, our heads are up and our eyes are wide open, and as a community as a whole, we're looking at it, and that includes our officers. And that is one element of prevention, is being able to discuss this topic like we are even right now. Another element of the prevention is that officers are tasked with identifying what we would consider to be at-risk groups that are within their policing beats or within their policing districts. For example, in the Southern District, we have a very large mosque. It's important that our officers that work that area understand that house of worship has the potential of being a common target, being a target location for hate. So spend extra time in that area, park in that area, get to know the parishioners, get to know the clerics that worship there and that lead there, know who they are. And for those areas to not be stranger to the officers, but for them to understand who those groups are in their particular beats, and that they make every effort on a regular basis to build that relationship. So these are all some of the preventative measures that we want our personnel to engage with, not once, not twice. It's not a check the box sort of mentality, but it's woven into the fabric of what we expect out of them on a regular basis. So what happens when there is a report of a hate crime, or something happens on the street where there's a perception that's a hate crime? The outline that we expect, or the policy procedures we expect our officers to follow, is that first and foremost to respond. They are to respond promptly to that assigned victim and that witness and that reporting party, and they are to conduct a thorough and complete preliminary investigation. We expect them to interview the victim. We expect them to interview witnesses. We expect them to interview the person who reported the crime. We expect them to conduct a reasonable cursory search for any relevant evidence that might be associated with that crime, and to preserve that evidence so that it can be collected and become part of the overall case, which might be needed for prosecution, which is what DDA Graves mentioned not that long ago. Once that preliminary investigative process is over, as soon as reasonable, that officer is expected to notify a supervisor without delay. What we don't want in the Richmond Police Department is for these possible hate crimes or obvious hate crimes to go undetected under the radar because a supervisor was not aware of them in a timely manner. So now they sit in a queue waiting for a approval process, or they sit someplace for a few days, and we lose valuable time. So we have a mandate that those officers actually bring this case to the attention of a supervisor as soon as reasonable, practical, without delay. And then there's a reporting process all the way up the chain, from the responding sergeant to the overseeing watch commander, all the way up to the captain that's responsible for the bureau and maybe even in the investigations. And then ultimately we let the chief know. So there is no delay in the chain of command understanding what's occurred. Why? Because we want to get on it immediately. We understand that these are very sensitive issues, and sometimes a victim can feel re-victimized if there's delay on the part of the police department from engaging with them and taking this matter seriously. And we're sensitive to that. So we don't want that to happen. So there is a process in place that requires the officers to report it immediately, all the way on up the chain. Once that's done and that preliminary police report has been taken, it is to be completed before that officer goes home for the day. So it's not a report that will sit in a queue someplace. Then it gets assigned to my division, the investigations division, and that gets assigned to a detective and a supervising detective sergeant, again, immediately without delay, so that there can be the follow-up, more detailed investigation. And what does that look like? That looks like the detectives will read that preliminary report. They'll contact that officer and that supervisor if they need to, or that watch commander, to get maybe a better idea of what occurred. And then they go back out to the scene oftentimes, and they'll walk the scene. They'll recontact the victim. They'll recontact witnesses. They're going to canvass the area at a much more broad perspective, looking for home audio, or not audio, but home video from CCTV, or other video surveillance that might be either city video or home video, looking to see if we can't capture additional evidence related. Maybe there's evidence that was discarded by the suspect that didn't get identified at the time that the officers were originally on scene. So the detectives are going to go back through everything with a fine-tooth comb. And one of the advantages that Richmond PD has, that the citizens of community of Richmond gets a benefit of, is the fact that we, out of the police department budget, participate in a cost-sharing program with the district attorney's office, where we have Paul Graves, who's on this call now. We have him in our police department. Not every police department in Contra Costa County has the benefit of that resource being under our roof, so that as an officer or a detective, when a case like this comes forward, we have access to the professional, we have access to the district attorney immediately to help give some guidance, so that we make sure that all of our T's are crossed, all of our I's are dotted, and that if this is a fileable case, we start working with the DA, which is Paul Graves, immediately working towards getting that case filed. Or there may be some points of follow-up that he identifies right away. Hey, make sure you talk to them about this. Look for this potential piece of evidence, or contact this family member, or whatever the case might be that might not already be in the mind of the detective. We have the ability of bouncing those things off the DA right away, and making sure we're putting together a case that can stand the test of the scrutiny of the filing process. So once that's done, we will submit the case. We'll package all of our evidence together, all of our police reports together. The case gets submitted to the district attorney's office, and then the matter will be brought before the committee, as Paul has already articulated, and a filing decision will be made. To give you kind of an idea how Paul talked about the fact that there were, since 2018, 6 cases filed, but yet Richmond police officers, we will write hate crime cases a lot more frequently than that, so that they get the attention that we want them to get, so that that preliminary investigation will get looked at a little bit more in depth than it being maybe just a simple assault. So if there's any hint that there might possibly be a hate crime involved with that felonious assault, or that robbery, or that burglary, or that vandalism, we ask our officers to go ahead and write the hate crime elements to it, so that they go through that immediate notification process and that immediate investigative process. So if you look at our stats with what we've presented to the FBI through the unified crime reporting process, in 2017, we had 5 cases. In 2018, we had 12. In 2019, we had 9. In 2020, we had 6. Now, that doesn't mean all those cases were filed as hate crimes. We already kind of covered that. But that's to give you kind of an idea that this actually, what we're expecting our officers to do, they're actually doing. They're writing those cases the way we want them to at the initial preliminary investigative stage, so that we can pause, be notified immediately that this might be a hate crime, and get moving on it right away without delay, to get to the bottom of whether it was or whether it wasn't, and utilizing our resources through the district attorney's office to get there. So that is essentially the process from the preliminary investigation, the initial call for service, to the preliminary investigation, to the more detailed investigation, to the point where it's presented to the district attorney's office for filing.
Thank you, Captain. Appreciate you for explaining that process. And for those who have questions and answers, we have one more speaker, and then will be time for your Q&A. And I picked up some questions off on Facebook Live that I'll feed through the chat. So if you could drop your question in the chat, we'll go ahead and we'll read your question. And also, if anyone on the panel has questions, you'll be welcome to participate in the discussion and any questions that you have at that time as well. So we're going to go on to our last presenter, and that is Sergeant Lucas. He's with our Personnel and Training Division, and he's going to talk a little bit about the training component of this to help officers be able to identify those components.
Good evening, Sergeant Lucas, Personnel Recruiting and Training Unit. Thank you very much for putting on this this talk. It's an extremely important topic, something that's very relevant specifically right now today. So in regards to training, first and foremost, I'd like to say that the Richmond Police Department does take pride in the training that we provide our staff, specifically to our officers. And we've been very progressive in getting ahead of a lot of these things before it becomes an issue. Excuse me. First and foremost, I'll start by saying that we also go above and beyond what the minimum recommendation is regarding specific trainings. And today we're talking about hate crime, so I'll talk about that specifically. Officers will initially receive training for hate crimes while attending the police academy through Learning Domain 42. It's required basically reading and information on how to identify hate crime, how to preliminary conduct an investigation, etc. But the statute through Assembly Bill 837 is that officers, after they complete the academy, only receive periodic updated training on the investigations of hate crimes, which post roughly says approximately every 5 years. I can tell you that the Richmond Police Department is performing some form or fashion of hate crime training approximately every year and a half. We have Advanced Officer School, which is on a 2-year rotation or 2-year schedule. So every other year, we are including a component of hate crimes, not to mention, which DDA Paul Graves had mentioned, the training bulletins that are sent out. He put one out in 2018. We routinely go back to that training bulletin, excuse me, and update it. We perform what's called lineup training and speak to our officers and go over that information on a regular basis. We also go over our policy, our internal policy regarding hate crimes and the investigation of hate crimes and what the responsibility of the officers are, the supervisors or sergeants, and then lieutenants, and et cetera. But above that, we also include, like I stated, additional hate crime training in our other trainings to include cultural diversity, racial profiling, principal policing, and hate crimes investigations, which again takes place during our Advanced Officer School on an every year or 2-year rotation. So even though post the commission, which basically states what legislative mandated training police agencies are required to perform on a regular basis, states that every 5 years this training should take place. We're doing it approximately every year and a half to every 2 years. Our next training cycle would be for the 2022 year training cycle, and there's a component for cultural diversity and hate crimes built into that particular training in our Advanced Officer School. So we're already planning to address this. We're just doing it now, which is a good thing. And again, the Richmond Police Department does a really good job of getting ahead of these types of things and making sure that our officers are receiving the most updated information that's based on legislative mandates and post requirements. And that's okay. And that's all I have in regards to training. Michelle, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that. So we want to open it up for discussion, and I've been monitoring some of the different questions. Feel free, folks, to now drop a question in the chat if you want to, or in the Q&A feature. And also have been trying to monitor what's going on Facebook Live. So there is a question that came in from Facebook Live, and this is directed, I think, at anyone on the panel, but I would imagine, you know, especially the DA's office would be particularly of interest, is do you all feel that, you know, there should be stiffer penalties for hate crimes? You know, DDA Graves talked about sometimes the challenge in being able to prove some of those elements. Anyone can speak to that, Chief, anyone.
I don't have a problem responding. I can't see if I am stepping on the chief. The answer to that is emphatically yes. The regular hate crime statutes are classified as misdemeanors. And if you get a hate crime enhancement on a crime, you can maybe elevate it to a felony, but it's an absolute yes. And I also think that it would be better if we could find a better way to articulate that which we all know is going on in a crime in a statute. But as I said before, the legislator is trying to balance the freedom of speech, which includes offensive speech, as well as what constitutes a crime. So absolutely, I think the punishment should be higher. And that is something that I think the community organizations on here have a voice with the legislator and can help make something like that happen.
Thank you, Paul. And I wanted to pose that question to anyone on the panel, particularly hearing from some of our community groups of what you all think and experience from folks who may come to you who may have either been victimized by hate or know someone who's been victimized by hate about stiffer penalties.
If I may, Michelle, and Ms. Graves is right that sometimes when you're prosecuting somebody, the charges are not as strong. And of course, as he's mentioned, this is a legislature that does the setting up the standard of what may be punitive. And sometimes we have to push them to even have a hate crime as the victim was a person of hate crime. We also get that, hey, look, other charges are more serious just because the person may have had a weapon or something else. So sometimes even the hate crime is not so as strong to add on to it. Things have changed, yes, of course, but they need to be much more stronger. But that's, again, it's all up to us to make our legislation, legislators to make those more punitive.
Thank you so much. And I see Mr. Robinson has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I think it should be stronger. And for the reason that just sometimes the embarrassment and the demeaning of persons when they've experienced sometimes verbally being attacked, but there's, as was explained, I guess there's very little unless they cross certain lines that you can get by with. But also with the NACP who have a formalized process, we review those kinds of things and looking for assistance in terms of helping to guide that person through this period that has been very demeaning to them, but all at the same time, it may not create any charges against a person. So that's the challenge we have that I'm finding.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I want to make sure if anybody else wants to answer that question, that you get a chance to respond. Okay. If not, there was a question that came in about the LD, I believe it's LD 42 training. I don't know if that goes to Sergeant Lucas, and training that is coming out for new folks, into the academy. I know you talked a lot about, new training and being able to help people identify, what that is. Maybe you could describe a little bit of what does that look like for a new officer that's, doing their training? How do they learn how to apply, this set of skills so that they're able to recognize this in, something that goes on in the neighborhood and be able to identify those elements?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So that's going to be a multifaceted answer because, again, in the academy, it's a controlled environment and it's book learning. So what they're learning in the academy is basically the definition of a hate crime, how to identify a hate crime. And then they get into kind of the preliminary investigation, the types of questions that you should ask in order to identify or recognize if you have a hate crime and what the enhancement of the penal code of the hate crime is. And that's really just book learning information. But then they get an opportunity to, when they become a police officer and they start working for an agency, to apply that information when they go through field training. So during field training, during our orientation, while they're out in the field, they're being provided constant and continual information and continual education on hate crimes, how to identify them, what questions to ask. And if possible, when we get into a situation where we have an officer respond to an assault, we may have them ask those types of questions during that preliminary investigation, even though it's not going down the road of a hate crime per se, but it's a good opportunity for that new officer to practice those skills and begin to start using them, because they don't happen as often, but when you do have the opportunity to at least practice asking those types of questions to determine whether or not you're dealing with what potentially could become a hate crime, we do make sure that they get those opportunities. And then there's a lot of role playing that takes place as well while the officers are in training. I'll also state that DDA Graves has also been really helpful with some of our new officer trainings. I know he's worked with some of our new officers as far as report writing, as well as courtroom testimony. So that all gets incorporated into the training as well.
So I think it would be helpful. I know you specifically, Michelle, mentioned LD Learning Domain 20, 42, which is a learning domain in the academy that talks about cultural diversity training. Michelle or Ernest, might be helpful to talk about what we're doing in regards to cultural training, cultural diversity training here, or cultural competency here on the PD.
One of the things that the chief really wanted to do was for new officers coming in. It's really important that we recruit from a diverse group of officers so that the officers are really reflective of the Richmond community. I grew up here in the Richmond community, and I think that, you know, Richmond is a very diverse city, and you need a set of officers who really can identify with all of the different residents and all of the different groups that make up the diversity of Richmond. So one of the things that the chief wanted to do was to make sure that we were really giving a really good orientation to the history of Richmond, you know, both the legacy of what happened in the shipyards, World War II, the Rosie the Riveter, the things we always talk about, but then talk about that difficult history, that history of racial injustice, that history of the police department and the abuse that went on in certain eras of our policing history here in the city that make people feel uncomfortable connecting with the police, so that we can be able to begin to really kind of address that. Because a lot of times it's a barrier. You know, I've worked in this, you know, field about 15 years. And when you talk to someone, you know, sometimes the first interaction that they had with the police, if it was negative and they had an interaction 10 years ago, they still have that interaction, you know, fresh on their mind when they interact with law enforcement. So we feel it's really important for new officers to come in and understand that. So one of the things we'll be doing is working with community-based organizations to help address that, and have officers be able to volunteer for at least 8 hours or more with community-based organizations to get an idea and a feel of Richmond before they go out onto the street. So they really are making some connection with community-based groups and organizations. The other thing we're asking them to do is to do some reading materials, some resource material that we feel might be helpful for them to understand some of these historical dynamics. And then the final thing we're asking them to do is a community interview process where they do some problem-based learning with a community member and they help apply some of their skills. So those are some pieces and some components in our effort for cultural competency and racial justice that are being rolled out now. And Sergeant Lucas, you may want to speak to how that would be applied.
So yes, so new officers are provided with an orientation prior to going into the field training program. And the new cultural awareness component has been added to that orientation. So the officers are provided with basically instructions and given 1 week to begin to start the reading. There's also videos that we've selected that would also go along with this program, and also to reach out to the community groups to try to make appointments to spend time, the 8 hours minimum that we're requiring of them throughout the training process. And then again, they also have to complete the interview of a community leader. They can choose multiple interviews of people to interview if they'd like. That's just basically a time management thing. Although all this information that they have that they acquire and that they get during this process is going to be reported back to a small group during the probationary review board in what they learned, which community groups they spent time with, what they spent time doing, what information they were able to get from them, what areas of concerns those particular community groups may have, and maybe even come up with a process on how to address an issue that has come up in a particular group that they worked with. So this is something that we're now requiring of all of our all of our new officers coming on board. And I think it's going to be a great addition to our training program, and we should reap lots of benefits from it moving forward.
Thank you, Sergeant Lucas. And I wanted to get back to the questions because we have a couple that have stacked up and I want to make sure that they get answered. There is a question, is the police department considering an outreach to high school students regarding hate crimes? So I'll throw that out to the panel, whoever would like to answer that or talk about why they think that that may or may not be a good way to go.
So that's a good question. And actually, I hadn't considered that, but that's something that we can consider now that we're not necessarily in the schools anymore as school resource officers. The outreach to young people is a little bit more difficult, but we're trying to figure out ways that we can still have an impact with the young people in our community through PAL and other organizations. So something to consider, and thank you for suggesting it. I think Chairman has.
I do see, I'm going to go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that's actually a great idea. One of the things that we have as Richmond Pride is we have previously had a police liaison for our community, but we think one of the biggest things that helps curb hate crimes within a community is education and feeling like people are interconnected amongst each other. And especially in the high school environment, there's a lot of othering of other people. And as well, once a person steps out of high school, they're often more likely to become more of themselves because they are not able to, they're outside of an environment that might have restricted them. But if you don't address these, the incorporation of these other diverse types of people into your community, you can get a very distorted perception of what the world you live in is and what the people in your community are made up of. And so I think it's a great idea, but I think it really is, it's about education even earlier than high school, I think, as well, because they need to see people from all different, the intersectional parts that people fall into all these different groups, but all of those groups are still a part of where you live and who you want to be a part of your community.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point of even starting earlier so that we can really begin to work on this since it can start very early, that othering process that you talked about. And so I think that's a really good point. Did anybody else want to answer that question?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. I'm not sure it would answer the question, but I'm in total agreement that the earlier we can start by getting young people to better understand, because I think they mimic a lot of what they get from the older generation or the adults. And sometimes we need to start to break that down as early as we can. I don't want to take credit for this, but I spent a little time with ninth graders a couple of years ago, and I was kind of surprised how the epithets that's shared among them, some of them are not historically, don't have enough history to understand the impact of that to some of the adults. So names and calling and othering and throwing around things just was amazing. And so we got to start early. I do agree. And that conversation has to be tailored to fit them at where they are, but most certainly start at that point.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question here. That's a good question. When can a verbal attack rise to the level of a hate crime? So a question about when verbal attacks actually transition into the level of a hate crime. I don't know if, Paul, that's something that you may want to speak to.
I will speak to that. And this is probably the single biggest question I received in all my years as a district attorney. When I started off, I talked about the First Amendment and the right to free speech and how it includes even speech that I find reprehensible, offensive, and all of us do. So to strike a balance, the hate crime statutes are not focused on speech. And we have to remember that. Speech is an element that we can use to prove it was a hate crime, but speech in and of itself is not a hate crime unless it's accompanied by a use of force on an individual, or that speech includes a threat to use physical violence on another person, and a reasonable person would be afraid because the suspect appeared to be able to carry out the threat. So even a threat to beat somebody up because of their protected status would constitute it, or damage to property. For the hate crime enhancements, you still need another crime to have been committed. And then we can use the speech to say that that crime was motivated by in whole or in part by the protected class of the victim. So unfortunately, the short answer is speech alone is not going to be a hate crime unless one of those three things is there. However, I don't think the community should be making that determination. If you feel uncomfortable or threatened by somebody's verbal threats or verbal speech, please contact the Richmond Police Department. They will take a report. Maybe it doesn't rise to the level of a crime yet, but we will have it on record. We'll know who you are, because people that do stuff like that tend to do it again. And we'll be able to build a case, and it can be useful in the future or for future cases, or if anything should happen to you, or the person continues to berate you and maybe does include a threat 2 weeks later. So that is the short answer, but I still can say, I cannot stress enough how important it is for people to reach out to the Richmond Police Department. The citizens of Richmond should not feel uncomfortable because somebody does not know how to be a normal human being and treat others with respect.
Thank you, Paul. I got another question, and it was more of a statement, and it was a statement about ethnic studies, saying this is the reason why ethnic studies and studying the history of our nation and all the different groups that have contributed and really built this country should be studied. And so I wanted to see if anyone on the panel would like to respond to that. I know that the chief is very interested in sharing that common history and having these conversations about race, which a lot of times people don't want to have the uncomfortable conversations about race and racial justice, but we need to have it if we're going to move past where we are now, which is a very, very dark time. So Chief, I don't know if you want to answer it, and if anybody else on the panel would like to answer it as well.
Sure, I absolutely agree that we need more ethnic studies, but as we also talk about the LGBTQ and just acceptance in general, there's been a lot of intolerance over the last few years, and we've seen it act with acts of violence across this country. And we as a nation need to address this issue of intolerance, and a lot of it is around race, but like I said, the LGBTQ and other marginalized communities, we have to address the issue. And I think that's like the big elephant in the room. A lot of times we talk about, with everything that's going on and law enforcement and dealing with people of color, and the issue that I think, like you said, Michelle, is difficult to actually talk about and have these difficult conversations about is race and the history of this country, and the systems that we have in place. And I hope that one day that we can get there to have those actual conversations, so that not to point fingers at anyone, but to work towards an acceptance of everybody, to look at different perspectives, to have an understanding of different cultures, so that we're not stuck in this place, this dark and heavy place that we've talked about and that we've seen over the last few years. Well, in the history, but more recently in these violent acts in the last few years.
Thank you. And I think I see Jamin's hand up, and Harpreet, I don't know if you hadn't lowered your hand, but feel free to jump in.
Yes, I was going to say that. Yeah, I think ethnic studies is really, really important. And I think it should be before graduation. But I think really speaking to the idea that when we are presenting people of different, when we're focusing on individual races, that we look at them as a large, diverse group of people, even within the Black community, within the Asian community, within even the LGBT community. Like there's a lot of there's a number of things that people are responding to when they become the focus of something you would cover in an ethnic studies class. But I think that we really need to address I'm just going to say it, the whitewashing of a lot of our history and the lack of contribution from people who aren't of the majority population who actually contribute vital and intrinsic things that are what we consider what make us American. And I think that, when we look at ethnic studies, it has to also address how or at least we have to contextualize how individual communities have looked at the LGBT community, because it is very different. I think the predominant narrative is often a very a cis white kind of narrative, and that is not the true narrative of what the LGBT struggle has been within America, within the Bay Area, and particularly here in Richmond. And so I think when we were talking about those things, we need to let them know that that it is not just a monolith of the Black community, that it's made up of all these individuals that are all very different, and we should and that what they contributed to our history. And so yeah, I think we just need to be really more focused on the intersectionality and focus on that wide tapestry.
Yeah, multiplicity of identity comes to mind, is that there's so many different identities even within identity. And so really, fleshing that out is really important. I wanted to talk explicitly about the focus on the API community. I think that, I've had a lot of questions that have come specifically about concerns about Asian Americans, within the last year with the rise of the pandemic and really the othering in some senses of the Asian American community, and some of the blame that has been placed because of bias and prejudice against the Asian American community. People are afraid. And what would you say to those who really are looking for some advocacy or looking for some support, are concerned that they might be a victim of a hate crime? Maybe someone who's elderly, who's afraid to kind of, walk down the street, because I think the flip side of fear is really empowerment. How do we work with each other as community, not divided, but coming together to kind of really empower and encourage people to seek some of the help that they need if they feel that they've been victimized by hate?
Michelle, if I may, if I'm just before the question prior, ethnic studies is important. We need to understand what our community is, all the different ethnicity that we live amongst in a city. I grew up in Berkeley in preschool and in high school and before. Just the city itself gave you a lot of ethnicity and part of that. But this curriculum, unfortunately, is only revised every 7 years in the school books. We do need a lot more revision within our school books in teaching for our young kids of all the different diversity that exists. Now, as to the API crime, it has skyrocketed in the last couple of years. And much of the blame goes on this prior administration, where they allowed a lot of the hate culture and voice and that was going around against the Asian Americans in Pacific and around COVID and so forth. The hate crime against the Asians have gone up 20-30%. And that is unfortunate. Even though we may not see it here, just as I mentioned, on just a couple of days ago, there was a mass shooting weeks ago against the Asian community, and now again in Indianapolis, where 8 people were killed in mass shooting and 4 of those were Sikhs. So this hate crime must be brought in some control, but the basic thing is to be able to educate. I hope after COVID, we can go back to many of the celebration that even for in Richmond that we used to have, the Juneteenth and the Cinco de Mayo, and other cultures have grown up. Hopefully we can do some of those things where we bring the communities together, bring the ethnicities together to understand our own culture. But of course, it all starts early education in schools. That's important as well.
Thank you. Thank you. All good points, all really good points. And I know we are going to have a Juneteenth celebration, June the 19th. So, and I know that there are other celebrations that kind of been dampened by COVID, but people are still coming together in the communities to kind of talk about some of the concerns and issues around racial justice and, issues around, how we unite as a community over this time in a different format. So, but I think that you raised a really important piece. So I think we're coming to the end of our time here. And yes.
Yeah, just a couple brief comments, one starting with the last question you raised, and I want to jump back to the ethnic studies piece. But I think being better informed, understanding cultural differences, and in being acceptance of one another is where I think we got to do more of that and provide opportunities for that to happen. And that takes me back to ethnic studies. I came through school, I learned to respect European culture, but not very much else, because that's embedded into our history, the studies of our history. And the lack of information about the various other cultures, a lot of who had participated gravely in the building of America, we don't study them. And I see a lot of my white friends who are still fairly ignorant about who I am and what I am. I had to learn that to get along, to exceed in the American society. So I think study of all of the cultures into our curriculum, sure, if it's got to come to ethnic studies, fine, but everyone needs to learn about each other. And I don't see a lot of that happening even today.
Really good points. Really good points. Obviously this is an important, conversation that we need to have, but the conversation also has to articulate into some action. And so I know that we have some resources here today. We have a lot of different groups that have worked towards racial justice. Here we have represented a couple of those different groups. But we really want to let everyone who's watching know if you need to get in contact with us, or if you have a group that you feel like we should be in contact with so that we can establish connection with them. We want to make sure there's an opportunity to do that. I think, through the conversation we've really learned is that it's important for us to stand with each other as communities and to engage and to have this kind of relationship. So we want to continue that relationship building beyond just this one conversation. It needs to be something that we're doing constantly to make it work. I wanted to end this panel by allowing everybody a few last words, like maybe a 30-second word of what is your hope for how we could come together to combat hate. And I will just kind of go through the list of our wonderful panelists who have done a great job sharing yourself in this space today. Really appreciate you for allowing us to hold this space. And I will start with our chief.
Thank you, Michelle. So my hope is that we'll continue to create a community that is loving of each other, accepting of each other, and a safe place for all of us. And so I hope that the people on here today and the people listening will get involved with the various community partners that we have, get involved with us, continue to spread the word about love instead of hate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And in addition to that hope, what do you see as a department's role? If you could say one thing you feel like we can commit to doing to help to combat and end hate, what would you say that would be?
I would say that we're going to continue to take this hate crimes very seriously, that we will do everything that we can to work with the district attorney's office to hold people accountable for crimes that involve hate.
And going next to Harpreet, hope and any commitment that you feel.
Absolutely. And just what we're doing today in itself is important. And I thank the Chief and yourself as well to putting this together and bringing the message to the community and through our television and Facebook that we must all work together and be inclusive of a city that has a multifaceted ethnicities and religions, and that we can rejoice and work together, and where hate will not be acceptable. And so that's important. But I also just want to just quickly say, Chief French, you sit in a position that is admirable, because we're also very happy today and a few days ago that Chief Magnus, who was once here, has been appointed, asked to be leading the Border Patrol, because he also grew up in Richmond, understanding the complexity of many different ethnicities, and the border exemplifies what's happening with this country, that is of inclusiveness and the need for many people to come to this country who are living under harsh conditions. So yes, we as a community must work together, and this is one of the most important part, which you're doing today as well.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Robinson.
Yes, my hope is that we can continue to provide this kind of a platform so we can broaden this conversation. And going forward, I believe that the NAACP can play a major role in terms of providing some outlets and some opportunities for advocating for the rights of all.
Thank you. And Jamin.
So I think that what we would hope for is beyond just panels like this, being able to actually see some activities of our individual communities coming together and having it be a shared space and have it be under the pretense of a diversity a celebration, or whether that be a gathering, or whether we have more of these talks, but something where we are actually interconnecting our individual groups more than just when we are needing to talk about the similar issues that we face. And I think the other thing that I would say that we should do is we need to hold our police and our government accountable to actually following through. We can't use words because they don't mend things. We need action, as you said earlier. And I think that really is the biggest point, is that we need to make sure that we are continuously pushing forward with progress, and understanding that apathy is what's going to constantly try to defeat us.
Thank you so much. And moving on to Paul.
Well, I guess simply my hope would be that we don't have to discuss hate crimes prosecution, because they're not happening, because people in our community and in the country can treat each other with respect and understanding, and we don't have to prosecute people for hate crimes because people are acting the way they should and respecting everybody. Until that time, what I would do, continuing my role at Richmond Police Department, is continuing to educate the officers, continuing to work with them to build cases, continuing to talk to victims and either explain why something wasn't filed or what we need to get something filed, and put together as many cases as we can to hold people accountable for their treatment of others in our community.
Thank you, Paul. And Captain Simmons.
So this can be the elephant in the room conversation, but it only stays that way if you never talk about it. I think for me, discussing it and being able to talk about it, I know within the confines of the police department, we want it to be normal to discuss these things, because we want folks to be able to understand the value and the importance of this conversation. And I hope that we can continue to have this conversation as a community at large. One of my favorite definitions of community in Merriam-Webster's dictionary is actually community is a group of like-minded people. And the reason why I like that definition is because it doesn't matter race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity. You can be community if you can get like-minded. And when you get like-minded, you can build relationship. And when you have relationship, that really becomes the example to the world that we can be as Richmond, in relationship with one another, standing with one another, police, community, white, Black, LGBTQ, Asian American, Pacific Islander. You know, we all are connected to one another, and as a community, we can have good, positive relationship that can be the example for others. And that's really what my hope is.
Thank you so much. And Sergeant Lucas.
Thank you very much. My hope is that through training, education, acceptance, and most overall tolerance, like Paul said, that hate crimes would become a thing of the past, and we won't have to deal with them at an investigative or a prosecution level. But until then, continue to have these difficult conversations, to talk about this issue, and to continue to take these types of crimes extremely serious, so that everyone is aware on what to do, what not to do, until eventually they stop happening. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank you all for participating, and for everyone who's participated on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and in the chat and question and answer. We appreciate that you took your time out to be a part of this. Yes, I got a lot of questions like, will this be available for people who weren't able to participate? Absolutely, it'll be available online. Thank you to KCRT for the great production of helping us to put this together today. Really appreciate the KCRT team. And if there are people who need help or resources, whether you need resources in other languages, because I know that oftentimes language can be a barrier for people, being able to express what has happened to them, or you need some assistance, please feel free to reach out to us. You can contact the department. You can also get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to work with you to be able to do that. And with that said, my hope is that we will continue to do this work to help make our community safer, so that everybody feels safe being who they are, just living life in public space. You have a right to exist, and you have a right to exist without fear. And I think my commitment is that we keep on working together as a community to doing that work, and really listening to each other. Because I think that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And so it's important for us to also listen and engage. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all. We appreciate you. And we look forward to having continued conversations on these kinds of topics. So let us know if you like the format. Thank you.
Thank you.